February 1968, the Cavern Club, Liverpool, the same venue where the Beatles had started their revolution just 6 years earlier. But that night, it would witness a different kind of revolution, one that happened in complete silence. Alvin Lee arrived at the venue feeling invincible. At 24, he was already being called the fastest guitarist in Britain. His band 10 years after was building a reputation across Europe for their high-energy performances and Lee's lightning-fast guitar work. Speed was everything to Lee. Speed separated the men from the boys. Speed was what made crowds scream. Lee had developed his philosophy over years of obsessive practice. 8 hours a day, every day, working on scales, arpeggios, chromatic runs. He had notebooks filled with exercise routines, metronome markings, technical goals. His practice room looked like a laboratory, charts on the walls showing scale patterns, a stopwatch for timing runs, even a mirror positioned so he could watch his picking technique for any inefficiency. His fingers could move across the fretboard faster than most people could think. He timed himself with scientific precision. He could play 16 notes per second cleanly, 18 on a good day. Most guitarists struggled with 8. He developed calluses so thick they felt like leather, muscles in his hands and forearms that were visibly larger than average from constant repetition. Lee treated guitar like athletics. Every movement had to be economical, efficient, purposeful. He'd studied the hand positions of classical violinists, the breathing techniques of wind players, anything that might give him an edge in speed and endurance. Music wasn't just art to Lee, it was a competition, and he intended to win. The Cavern was packed that night. 10 years after was headlining, but there were rumors that some American guitarists might sit in during the break. Lee didn't pay much attention to rumors. American blues guys came through England regularly. They were usually good, but they were old school, slow, deliberate, traditional. Lee represented the future: speed, power, technical precision. During soundcheck, Lee ran through his usual warm-up routine, scales at increasing tempo until his fingers were moving so fast they became a blur. The sound engineer nodded approvingly. The other musicians backstage watched with a mixture of admiration and intimidation. This was what guitar could do in the right hands. This was evolution. Someone mentioned that Jimi Hendrix was in the club. "The guy with the afro?" Lee asked, not stopping his practice routine. "Yeah, heard he's been causing a stir in London." Lee shrugged. He'd heard the name. Another blues guitarist from America, probably playing the same old pentatonic scales everyone knew. Lee had moved beyond blues. He was playing classical scales, jazz progressions, things that required real technical ability. "Anyone can play blues slow," Lee said to his bassist. "Blues is easy. It's when you speed it up that it gets difficult. That's when you separate the real guitarists from the pretenders." The show started at 9 p.m. Lee's set was explosive. His guitar work was machine-like in its precision, inhuman in its speed. The crowd went wild. Song after song of blistering fast runs, complex passages that left other guitarists shaking their heads in disbelief. This was what rock guitar was becoming: technical mastery at impossible speeds. During the break between sets, Lee was backstage toweling sweat from his hands when someone approached him. "Alvin Lee?" Lee looked up, a young black man with an enormous afro, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in a different century. Colorful, flowing, completely unlike what British rockers wore. "Yeah, Jimi Hendrix. Great set, man. Really impressive speed." Lee studied him. Up close, Jimmy looked smaller than expected. Quiet, almost shy. Nothing intimidating about him. "Thanks. You're the American everyone's talking about?" "I guess. Blues guitarist, right?" Jimmy smiled slightly. "Among other things." Lee had dealt with blues purists before. They always wanted to lecture young guitarists about feeling over technique, about the importance of tradition. Lee had heard it all. "Look," Lee said, not unkindly, "I respect what you older guys did. Blues is the foundation, I get that. But rock is evolving. It's not enough to just play slow and emotional anymore. Audiences want more. They want technical ability. They want speed." "Speed," Jimmy repeated quietly. "Yeah, Speed separates the real guitarist from the weekend warriors. Anyone can play blues slow, but can you play it fast? Can you play it clean at tempo? That's the real test. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. Mind if I borrow a guitar? Lee gestured toward his backup Stratocaster. Be my guest. Jimmy picked up the guitar, plugged into Lee's amplifier, and spent a moment adjusting the settings. Lee expected him to launch into some traditional blues number, something slow and predictable. Instead, Jimmy played one note. Just one note. Not a fast run, not a complex chord, not a blazing solo. One single note, somewhere around the 12th fret. But he didn't just play it and move on. He held it. He bent it slightly, then brought it back. He added vibrato, not fast mechanical vibrato, but something that breathed, that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lee watched, confused. Where was the impressive part? Where was the technical display? Jimmy continued holding the note, but now he was adding subtle variations. The bend would go a little higher, then settle back. The vibrato would intensify, then soften. He was having a conversation with a single note, and somehow that note was responding. 30 seconds passed. Jimmy was still on the same note. Lee glanced around the backstage area. Other musicians had stopped what they were doing. The usual between-sets chatter had died down. Everyone was listening to one note. The bass player from the opening band had been tuning his instrument. His hands were now frozen on the tuning pegs. A roadie carrying amplifier cables had stopped mid-step, cables dragging on the floor behind him. Even the venue's sound engineer had emerged from his booth, standing in the doorway with his headphones around his neck, staring at Jimmy with an expression of confusion and growing fascination. But it wasn't just one note anymore. Somehow, without playing anything else, Jimmy was making that single note sound like an entire melody. The way he bent it, the way he controlled the sustain, the way he used silence between the vibrato pulses, it was creating the illusion of multiple notes, of complex harmony, of emotional depth that Lee had never heard before. Lee found himself leaning forward, despite himself. He'd always prided himself on being able to analyze any guitarist's technique instantly. He could break down the most complex solos, identify the scales, map the fingerings, understand the theory. But this was different. There was no technique to analyze, no complex pattern to decode. Just one note, being explored with such intimacy that it felt like eavesdropping on a private conversation. 40 seconds. Lee realized his hands had stopped moving. He'd been unconsciously practicing finger exercises during the conversation, the way he always did. But now his hands were still, frozen, as he tried to process what he was hearing. This shouldn't be impressive. It was just one note. No speed, no technical complexity, no scales or arpeggios or anything that demonstrated real skill. But the backstage area had gone completely quiet. 20 professional musicians, all of them experienced performers, were standing motionless, listening to a single note being bent and shaped by someone they'd never heard of. 50 seconds. The note began to decay naturally, the sustain fading, but even the fade was controlled. Jimmy was making the death of the note as expressive as its life. As the sound died away, he didn't rush to play another note. He let the silence hang in the air, complete silence in a room full of musicians. Then Jimmy unplugged the guitar and handed it back to Lee. "Nice guitar," he said quietly. "Thanks." Lee took the instrument back, staring at it as if it had transformed into something unrecognizable. "That was," Lee started, then stopped. He didn't have words. "One note," Jimmy said with a slight smile. "Pretty slow." Lee looked up at him. The comment should have been sarcastic, but there was no malice in Jimmy's voice. No mockery, just a gentle observation. "How did you—" Lee began, then trailed off again. "How did I what?" "Make it sound like that, like there was more than one note." Jimmy tilted his head slightly. "Maybe there was." Lee frowned. "I heard you. You played one note." "You heard one note," Jimmy agreed. "But what did you feel?" Lee had never been asked that question about guitar playing. What did he feel? He felt confused, impressed despite himself, somehow smaller than he had 5 minutes earlier. "I don't understand," Lee said. "Nothing to understand," Jimmy replied. "Just something to experience." He started to walk away, then paused and looked back. Your speed is incredible, by the way. Really impressive technical ability. But speed and music aren't the same thing. Sometimes the fastest way between 2 points isn't a straight line. Lee watched him disappear into the crowd gathering for the second set. 10 years after second set that night was technically perfect. Lee played every run cleanly, every solo precisely. But something had changed. In the middle of his fastest passages, he kept thinking about that single note, about how much emotion Jimi had packed into something so simple. The audience responded enthusiastically, but Lee felt distant from his own playing. He was executing technique, but was he making music? After the show, Lee sought out Jimi in the crowd. He found him near the bar, talking quietly with some other musicians. "Can I ask you something?" Lee said. Jimi nodded. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was a kid, maybe 15 years. "And you never felt the need to develop speed?" Jimi considered this. "Speed for what? To get where faster?" To, to impress people, to show that you can really play." "Can't you show that you can really play by really playing?" Lee realized he was asking the wrong questions, but he didn't know what the right questions were. "That note you played," Lee said, "I've never heard a single note express so much." "Every note has everything inside it," Jimi replied. "You just have to know how to let it out." Lee frowned, trying to process this. In all his years of study, no guitar teacher had ever talked like this. They talked about finger positions, scale patterns, theoretical concepts, but never about what was inside a note. "I don't understand. A note is a frequency. It's physics. How can it have more?" Jimi smiled, but not in a condescending way. More like someone remembering their own confusion from years past. "Play an A," he said simply. Lee looked confused, but played an A note on his guitar. "Now play the same A, but think about your mother." Lee hesitated, then played the note again. Even to his own ears, it sounded different. Softer somehow, more personal. "Same frequency," Jimi said quietly. "Different story. The note doesn't change. You do. And when you change, the note changes with you." This concept was revolutionary to Lee. He'd spent years perfecting his technique, making every note sound exactly the same. Consistent, precise, reliable. But Jimi was suggesting that variation, that personal expression, was not a flaw to be eliminated, but a goal to be pursued. "Can you teach me that?" Jimi smiled. "Can't teach it. Can only show you where to look." "Where do I look?" "Inside the note. Inside the silence around the note. Inside yourself." Most guitarists spend their time learning to control the instrument, but the real music happens when you stop controlling and start listening. Lee felt like he was getting a glimpse into a completely different approach to music, one where technical perfection was just the beginning, not the end goal. Lee left the club that night feeling like he'd been introduced to a completely different instrument. He'd been playing guitar for 8 years, had mastered speeds that most guitarists couldn't even attempt, but he'd never thought about what was inside a single note. The drive home was surreal. Lee kept replaying that minute in his mind, trying to understand what had happened. He'd built his entire identity around speed, around the ability to execute complex passages that others couldn't. But sitting in his car in the Liverpool darkness, he realized he'd never once asked himself what he was trying to say with all those notes. He spent the night in his practice room, but for the first time in years, he didn't run scales. Instead, he plugged in his guitar and played a single note. Just one. He tried to hold it the way Jimi had, tried to find emotion in the bend, meaning in the vibrato. It felt clumsy, unfamiliar. His hands wanted to run off into familiar patterns, comfortable speed exercises that felt like coming home. But he forced himself to stay with the one note. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. His hands cramped from the unfamiliar restraint. He'd trained them to move constantly, and holding still was actually more difficult than the blazing runs he was known for. By morning, Lee had filled an entire notebook with observations about that single note experience. Not technical notes, he had thousands of those already. These were different. Questions he'd never asked before. What makes one note more expressive than another? How do you make silence as powerful as sound? When does technique serve music? And when does it get in the way? Over the next few months, Lee began experimenting with sustain, with bends, with the spaces between notes. He didn't abandon his speed. That was still part of who he was as a player. But he started incorporating moments of simplicity, single notes that he would explore rather than rush past. His bandmates noticed the change. "You're playing different," his bassist said after a rehearsal in May. "Different how?" "Less frantic, more, I don't know, more like you're listening to yourself." Lee nodded. That was exactly what he was doing. For the first time in his career, he was listening to his own playing instead of just executing it. In a 1987 interview with Guitar World, Lee was asked about the evolution of his playing style. "There was a night at the Cavern in '68, Lee said. "I met this American guitarist named Jimi Hendrix. At the time, I thought guitar was about speed, about technical ability, about showing people how fast you could play. Then Jimmy played one note, just one note, for about a minute. And in that minute, he communicated more emotion, more musicality, more pure artistry than I'd managed in entire concerts." Did it change your approach? It changed everything. "I realized I'd been confusing speed with urgency, technique with expression. Jimmy showed me that the fastest way to reach someone isn't necessarily the quickest path across the fretboard." "Do you still practice speed?" Lee smiled. "I practice everything. Speed, slow bends, single notes, silence. But now I know they're all just tools. The music happens in between the techniques, in the choices you make about when to use which tool." Any advice for young guitarists? Find someone who can play one note better than you can play 100. Then listen very carefully to what they're not playing. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Lee was devastated. He'd only met him a few times after that night at the Cavern, but those encounters had fundamentally changed his understanding of guitar. At a 10 years after concert in London 2 weeks later, Lee dedicated a song to Jimmy's memory. But instead of playing one of his trademark speed showcases, he played a slow blues. Just one note at a time, each one bent and sustained and explored. The audience, expecting pyrotechnics, initially seemed confused. But as the song progressed, as Lee found emotions inside individual notes that he'd never accessed before, the crowd grew completely quiet. When he finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the applause started, different from the usual screaming and whistling. This was respectful applause, moved applause. After the show, an old blues musician approached Lee backstage. "That was beautiful, son. Who taught you to play like that?" Lee smiled, thinking of a February night 2 years earlier, when a quiet American had shown him that everything he thought he knew about guitar was just the beginning. "A friend," Lee said. "A friend who knew that sometimes one note is enough." The night Alvin Lee met Jimi Hendrix, speed encountered soul. And in that encounter, Lee discovered that the fastest way to reach an audience wasn't through technical dazzling, but through emotional honesty. Sometimes the most profound lessons come in the simplest packages. Sometimes revolution happens one note at a time. And sometimes slowing down is the only way to catch up with what music really means.